Hey everyone, thanks for joining this conversation and watching this video. It is outside of the norm for me in that I typically talk about social media and technology. And today I wanted to use my social media platform to further a conversation that I think is critically important. It's something that has it just has broken my heart over the last year, but really over the last few months. A stat I recently heard is that crime against Asian Americans in New York City is up 900% in 2021. It was up 150% in 2020. It's devastating to understand that reality. And there's a situation I don't know that I can emotionally share it that happened to my daughter's school. That just it's devastating what's happening in our world. So I've asked my friend Hyun to join us. I had a similar conversation a couple of years ago with my friend Jason Caston around Black Lives Matter, because honestly, I had a family member um, who I had a conversation with. I said, you know what, actually, you should go to lunch with one of your Black friends and talk to him about Black Lives Matter. And he said, I don't know anyone who's Black. And so I recorded that conversation to allow others that might not be able to have a direct conversation or know someone. And so I've invited my friend Drew to have this conversation today about Asian Americans. So Drew, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nils. Really appreciate you and your friendship.
I appreciate it. Yeah. So those that don't know you, Drew, can you share a little bit about who you are and what you do and a little bit about your background?
Yeah, I'm a pastor here in New York City. I lead a church called Hope Midtown. That's part of the Hope Church NYC family of churches, which we started a few years ago. We also started an urban church plan network called the New City Network. That centers around the values of urban, multi-ethnic, spirit, emotional health, and mission. And then, and then I also work with the Emotionally Healthy Discipleship team, which I know that you're involved with as well. Really have been deeply transformed and influenced by Emotionally Healthy Discipleship and Pete Scazzaro, who's been a spiritual father and mentor to me in many ways. So, yeah.
And that's how we connected is through Pete. And I remember Pete connected us as we were considering moving to Roosevelt Island, and you were basically the pseudo mayor of Roosevelt Island at the time, and have since moved into Midtown, and we are loving the island. What can you share a little bit, Drew, about your heritage as an Asian American, your background?
Yeah. So I was born and raised to Korean immigrant parents who immigrated to the States, to Los Angeles in the mid 1970s. And so I was born in 1979. My parents immigrated to the States in 1975.
Yes.
And so I grew up in Los Angeles, California, in this neighborhood in West Los Angeles as one of the few Korean kids in my neighborhood. Along with my three brothers. And so the four of us were often the only Korean kids, the only Asian kids. And so at the elementary school that we went to, grew up as definitely an ethnic minority, was made fun of quite a bit, and was definitely knew that I was not, quote unquote, from here. In our neighborhood growing up, there's a house that still sits on our block where every time to this day, whenever I'm walking across that house, my heart starts to beat a little bit faster, just because I just remember anytime we walked across that house, or anytime we walked in front of the house or rode our bikes in front of the house, the image of this voice from the second floor window yelling out, "Go back to your country, Ching Chong Wong," like making fun of us and deriding us. Like, it's interesting that even to this day, as a grown adult, like going by that house, there's anxiety that fills my heart. So I actually never walk by the house on the same side of the street. I actually go across the street so that I can walk across, just because, again, the anxiety and the fears that I grew up with in that neighborhood. And so just kind of grew up in that environment throughout, being made fun of, being called names, and the neighborhood bully picking fights with my oldest brother, my dad telling us that all we have is each other and we need to look out for each other, the four of us boys, because he was always off at work. And so the feeling of, like my race is different, and that I need to look out for my brothers and things like that, and be fearful for, being picked on or being pushed around in school and in our neighborhood was definitely a real fear that I grew up with. So, sorry, I jumped right into that, but
no, that's heavy. Let's journey, because I think that's it. I grew up as a white boy in the South, and so there's an ignorance that comes with that without having that understanding of what it's like to be a minority, and the effects of hearing that, and then even how that. I'm curious, how did that affect you personally as you got into your kind of high school, college, and adult years? That experience as a child.
Yeah, well, I think it affected me in a couple of ways. Number one is, I think it became something that I just learned to accept and just kind of like muscle up and kind of try to pound through.
Yeah.
And so in a weird way, like my father would later in his life would tell me about some of the experiences with racism that he experienced, especially as an immigrant with a thicker accent.
Yeah.
And it was pretty horrifying to hear some of the stories that he would tell about the racism that he had received.
Yeah.
But I think for me, kind of growing up, as an immigrant, there's like a couple of competing messages. One competing message is like, you don't belong here. Yeah. And one message that my father, though, gave us is like, just keep working hard. Keep working, put your head down and work hard. So that's kind of what we did. It was kind of something that we just learned, like, this is part of life. Like we absorb a lot of hostility, and that's what we do is we basically just pound through it. So on one end, that was one message that we were receiving was like, just pound through this. It's not that bad. You're being called names. You're being pushed around. You're being bullied, whatever. Like you just pound through it, and we're grateful to be in this country. So on one end, it was this really confusing, like, yeah, it was painful, but we just kind of pounded through it. And the ethic was basically like, we just work hard to get through whatever challenges that we face. And, but here's what it did for me internally. I think there are a couple of things. Number one is this feeling of not being from here, this perpetual foreigner, being someone who's different. That's stayed with me for my whole life.
Yeah.
Even though that I'm born and raised here, even though English is my first language, is my second language, but it's my primary language. And it's a big part of my job as a pastor is to use words and to communicate. I tell this story of in seminary, there was a friend from Latvia. So he's this Latvian person who was an international student who had never been to the States before. And he was a classmate of mine in the greater Boston area. And he knew that I lived in New York and would work in New York. And so I'd go on the weekends to New York. And so one weekend he's like, can I come to New York with you? And I'm like, yeah, sure. So he came to New York and I'm showing him around the city, and he's just like soaking in everything about New York, the buildings, the subways. Yeah. And it was interesting. There were these little moments where, like, for instance, people would stop us and be like, oh, okay, which way is uptown and which way is downtown? But they wouldn't talk to me. They would talk to him. And then we'd go to a restaurant. Yeah. And at the restaurant, they would bring the check to him, and they wouldn't bring it to me, even though I was kind of the one treating him and stuff.
Yes.
And so it was funny. He turned and looked at me, and he's like, Drew, this is so funny. I'm Latvian. And everyone thinks that I'm the American who's from here. And he actually has an accent as well, like an English accent, Latvian accent. And yet somehow people perceived him as being more American than I am. And I grew up here, and English is my primary language. And so like that experience, I think encapsulates some of, that feeling of like, you'll never truly be from here.
Wow.
And so that perpetual foreigner, that you are not American, and you'll never be American enough. And so, it's interesting even talking to my kids about it now, because, and it's amazing being in a place like New York where it's incredibly diverse, but still that experience persists and exists for people here. Actually, Michael Luo, I don't know if you know him, Nils, but he's an editor for the New Yorker and used to work for the New York Times. And there was an experience actually where he and his family, who live on the Upper East Side, they were, and I can't remember the exact details, but they were at a restaurant, And it was during a time of also heightened anti-Asian American sentiment.
Okay.
And as he's walking his family, like this woman, like, I guess somehow, like, unbeknownst to him, he was either in her way or something. And then she started yelling at him on the Upper East Side, like, go back to your country. And he's just so startled, and his young kids are there and his wife is there. And both he and his wife grew up in the States. And of course his kids are American. So like, and he said that he chases her down. He goes, this is my country.
Yeah.
Like, what are you talking about? This is my country. Like, I grew up here. I'm an American citizen. And the thing about Michael is that he's been educated. He was Ivy League educated, worked for the New York Times. Like, no matter how much he's achieved in terms of, you know, like in terms of, I don't know, accolades of the American dream, yet he's still seen as like this perpetual foreigner. And so, so I think that's one narrative that happened. And that's something that I've internalized. And I think something else that I've internalized is just that people will mistreat me. And, you know, I think the rise of violence now, like, it's amazing that it's come to consciousness in the American experience, because I grew up kind of just thinking, well, no one really cares about how I'm feeling or our experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly reached a crescendo now where it's like, no, this is wrong. And in a weird way, with all the experiences of Black lives, especially in this season, in a weird way, I've felt guilty even bringing up the Asian American experience, because I know the history of our country related to Black lives has been so fraught with pain and injustice.
Yeah.
And so in a weird way, the Asian American experience, or at least for me, has been like, I feel almost ashamed to bring this up. But then at the same time, I feel like this has got to stop. Like when people are being randomly assaulted, and when people are using language and slurs in our government that would denigrate people, that would cause this sentiment, it just needs to stop. And so for Asian Americans, there's this weird experience of, like, on one end, we're kind of tabbed as the model minority, right? Mm-hmm. Like you know, whites can look at Asians and say, like, oh, well, you've got wealth, and, you know, you are socially mobile and all this stuff. And this is the model minority. See what Asian Americans have done. And then that term can then be weaponized against, for Asians against people of color. So then people of color then start to see Asians also as, you know, honorary whites. Wow. And so the experience, you know, having the experience of racism from other ethnic minorities in our country as well, simply exacerbates this feeling of, like, shame around my own kind of race identity, where we are stationed in life, and things like that. And so, so it's been an experience of just trying to break through that. And one of the things that people aren't aware of is that, you know, you mentioned the statistics related to anti-Asian violence, but actually statistics related to depression and bullying, for Asian Americans, they're the highest percentage of ethnic groups that get bullied. Wow. And teenagers that are dealing with mental illness. And so people can talk about model minority, can talk about all this. Well, look, you guys have wealth or social mobility or whatever it might be, and you don't have the history that Black and brown people have had. Yeah. And while all of that might be true, there's also this other story of the deep pain and alienation that Asian Americans have felt in this nation. And
how do you, Drew? It's how you shared about your dad and how he kind of spoken to you as a child, because I think in some ways as a parent, there are situations you don't know what's the right way to handle this. How do you now as a dad approach this with your kids?
Yeah, you know, I think what's hard about answering that question is I think a fear, not a fear, but a hope that I always had was that my children would never have to experience this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think as the random attacks were happening in the city, you know, my wife, interestingly, she grew up in Houston, Texas.
Yeah.
And she, interestingly enough, does not have the same experiences of alienation, racial slurs, and all that stuff that I went through. And so for me, so she often says that I have a greater sensitivity to some of these dynamics of race and stuff, which is probably true.
Mm.
But it was interesting because I think with her, she's been very shaken as well by everything that happened.
Yeah.
And so now in a city that we love, where we used to just walk out freely, like every time she's going out, I am telling her, hey, be careful. Yeah. Every time I know she's going to go on the subway, or anytime she goes out, and it might be like right before sundown, like I'm like, hey, can you just not go out? Right? Can you? And then we had, we sat down our kids and we had to have a conversation with them. And we said, people in this world are going to say to you that you're not from here, or they might say things about how you look and your eyes. But I want you to know that, you're loved by God, and that you're a child of God. You don't have to feel like you're second class. You don't have to feel like you're not important. And these people that say these things, those are wrong. And so I just never thought I'd be having those conversations with my kids, call it naivete or whatever, but here I am, and our family are Christians who love living in this country,
Yeah.
and it's just been painful to just think about the next generation and to sit down with our kids and to think that somehow they will be denigrated. So, and I'm not sure if you heard, but there's another pastor here in the city, Abe Cho at Redeemer. He was sharing a story about how his kids, when COVID happened, and his kids were in the elevator of their building, and he said that one of his young son was there with his older sister, and she's a teenager, and he coughed. He had his mask on, he coughed, and someone right there just went off on this little boy in the elevator, and his older sister, who's a teenager, is witnessing all this as well. And they're in this enclosed space, and this woman is berating this young boy. And this is happening in the city, and it's real,
Yeah.
And so it's been really painful. It's been painful. And I think when it comes to the next generation, like I mentioned, the way that we were taught was like, don't mention this, like, don't talk about it. And for me, it's like a part of me doesn't want to talk about it, but I have to, because it's affecting people we love. And, I know that one of the big mantras in the previous generations of pastoral leadership is like, just don't talk about politics.
Yeah.
And for sure, I kind of adopt that mantra as well. We don't take a side, right or left wing or anything like that. And I take that posture. But at some point I have to talk about people that are impacted by politics.
Yeah.
And when people are impacted by politics, not only by policies, but by the language that's used and things like that, like, it's not like I'm trying to talk about politics. I'm trying to talk about how our people are being affected by politics. And if our people in our congregations are experiencing great pain, of course, I'm going to care about what they care about, which is not having to experience this kind of pain in their lives. So Anyhow, I know that was kind of a wide ranging explanation, but
Yeah, it's so it's so hard to comprehend. I think one of the things that I am learning in this season, and one of the things we experienced just maybe 2 months ago is while we were walking our kids, maybe it was more at the height of coronavirus, walking our kids to school, somebody yelling out their window on the Upper East Side, a racist slurred an Asian family walking to school in their neighborhood. And
wow.
it was just so real, that was one of those moments where it just is, I can't believe I'm hearing this and seeing this right now. But I know that that's just, at the end of the day, we're just seeing it now more clearly. I think what you've experienced is even passive forms of racism every day that I think that most of us aren't aware of. What are some of maybe the, just for people regularly, that unintentionally maybe actions that they take or things that they say that affect Asian Americans in a negative or unhealthy way? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think a big part of the pain that Asian Americans perhaps experience is, I don't think that the Asian American story is very well known amongst most people that I've met.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I actually have a whole lot of, I guess you could call it grace for kind of ignorant comments or comments that are made that, and I know that some people are far more reactive to things like that.
Yeah.
I mean, one such comment, for instance, is the comment like, "Oh, your English is so good," or things like that, where it's kind of like, "Oh, well, yeah, I've been educated in this country for most of my life. I have multiple kind of whatever degrees or whatever it might be," and so like, but I actually have a whole lot of grace because I don't. As much pain as I've experienced related to some of those microaggressions, I just realized people just don't know the story of most Asian Americans. And so that's why I appreciate you even just asking me about my story growing up. Not many people have asked me about my story. And so just being able to hear these stories as it becomes more widely known, like, hey, there's a group of people, the Asian American story, who have felt like perpetual foreigners and who have been kind of denigrated, but work hard, and yet at the same time feel like we continue to hit these ceilings related to being to full acceptance here in the country. Like, I think that story just needs to be heard more and more.
Yeah.
And then I think when friendships are made, and obviously, some of that is because of the wider portrayals in media and so on and so forth of Asian Americans. But I think hopefully as more and more stories are known of Asian Americans, I think it helps give people more texture and relationships and friendships. And so, so that's why I'm really appreciative of you kind of, and I think whenever we can approach with curiosity and care, towards people who are different and just listening to their experiences, I think it makes a significant difference.
Yeah. That's helpful. I want to circle back to something you shared earlier about, and I think this is a conversation about race, but I do think that the political climate affected, this conversation so significantly and so much of what's happened. I'm curious, when you heard the terms, and maybe there are more that I haven't heard, but China virus and Kung flu, we see some of the other effects of that. How did that personally affect you, though, when you heard those statements or those words being used?
I mean, my heart sank. It was waffling between deep hurt and anger. Just because I knew, the words have consequences, and I just knew that those words would have consequences.
Yeah.
And, what was interesting was, even Nils, as you just shared that story of you walking on the Upper East Side, and you heard someone from the window shouting at another family and stuff. Oh my gosh, I just felt like needles, because it reminded me of that memory that I just shared earlier about my own kind of upbringing. Yeah. And I just felt such pain. And I think what was harder about it was when those words were used at a rally or whatever it was, and seeing the clip and seeing people laugh and cheer. In fact, I think it was said at a church. I just, like, it just felt like the ultimate betrayal. Like, maybe betrayal is too, but like when it was said in a church, it just felt like I could not. I just could not believe it. I could not believe that people would cheer at words that would denigrate a people group. Now, I understand like how, people are saying, well, the origins of the coronavirus and all that stuff, but like there are other ways to talk about it without marginalizing an entire race. And so it was just those words and for it to be cheered upon. I just, like, even right now, I'm having a hard time, like, just describing how deflating and painful that experience was. And, if people say, well, it was just in jest or it was just a joke, well, like, that joke has led to me being called names and, Abe's son being yelled at and, a whole rash of violence that has arisen. And it's, to say that somehow those things are divorced from one another, the using of those words and the experience, it just goes so far against the experience that I've had and the experience of so many others, Asian Americans that I know. Yeah. So.
What, I think this is where, even with Black Lives Matter, what's powerful is that awareness is becoming greater, but practically, even with awareness, it doesn't solve the issue. What can be done to, and I say fix this, I don't know that we can just fix this, but what can be done to improve this today?
Yeah, well, I personally, and obviously I'm a pastor, so I'm biased here, I think that communities of faith can make a significant difference. And I think communities of faith that step into the gospel story, because you're right, like, even, I know that even in the Christian world, like the phrase Black Lives Matter has all sorts of, and really at the end of the day, most people don't even know about the organization Black Lives Matter. People are basically simply saying that historically marginalized people, like, they matter. They are imbued with the image of God. And therefore we need to uplift and celebrate and recognize the wholeness and the fullness of God in each human being and in each race. And so I think that the church can have a prophetic witness. I think for the church to be at the forefront of celebrating and upholding the dignity of lives that have historically been marginalized makes a significant difference. I think solidarity in so doing is really important. And I think creating communities where, I once heard that the best critique of the bad is a practice of the better. And for me, what that has meant is, more than simply saying words, what does my life look like? Is my life like situated in a manner in which I am doing my best to be in solidarity with the marginalized communities in my neighborhood and in the country? Am I doing my best to empower those folks who historically have not been empowered for different positions of leadership? Are we cultivating communities that break down barriers and that bridge, differences, ethnically, socioeconomically. And so I think all of that is part of the package of what we can do. I think it's not only standing in solidarity, I think listening is key. Listening to each other's stories. I think then being proximate with those who are different than us. Brian Stevenson in Just Mercy, he talks about how you have to be proximate, that it's out of relationships, like friendships between you and I, where I get to understand, why you're such a big San Antonio Spurs fan, and vice versa. Or I'm not a Spurs fan, but, but I think that proximate, like, I love the fact, Nils, that you were down to eat Korean food with me, and that you could hear more about my culture and learn about my culture. And that we can sit down and I can hear about your story and your life journey, so I think becoming proximate and then cultivating real communities that are able to go beneath the surface. I think emotionally healthy discipleship, doing some of the genogram work of our own family histories related to race. A month ago, I did in one of the chapters in emotionally healthy spirituality, we have a chapter on grief and a grief chart through different ages. And it was through that chart that I was writing the experiences of racism that I had from the ages of 3 to 12 and 12 to 18. And it was so powerful. And then being able to share that with other people and for them to listen to me without judgment or but to hear it as what I experienced has just been a really powerful experience. And then to stand in the gap, to do our best. And I know that it won't be solved in a day, and I mean, historically, and I grew up during the time of the LA riots where there was significant pain and division amongst African Americans as well as Korean Americans. And so this isn't just like an Asian white thing. It's not just a black white thing. It's like, what does the gospel have to say? And so for me, I think those are the keys. I know that for myself, I've been so humbled over this past year to really make it a point to repent of the ways that I've been complicit or silenced with the pain of our Black and brown brothers and sisters. And even COVID and the way that it's disproportionately impacted communities of color. I realize I have to continually repent of my own racism, even though I've experienced my own alienation. I've got racist tendencies in me, and I've had a family of origin I've had messages that I've gotten from my immigrant parents about how to view different races that I need to repent of and that I need to. So I think doing the self-work is really important, and being in a posture of repentance. I realized this past year and a half for me, it's been COVID for sure, but it's been more so the repentance around the complicit nature of the church around justice for poor and marginalized communities, especially on behalf of Black and brown lives.
Yeah. One of the things that I've heard said is that Sunday mornings is the most segregated hour in America. I've also heard it defended as people want to even worship in a cultural context. How do you as a pastor see that and navigate that? And how would you encourage pastors and church leaders around this?
Yeah. And I think, I don't think diversity is the goal.
Okay.
I think the goal is the gospel. And I think the gospel and the Spirit create these communities of dynamic bridge building.
Yeah.
And so, because I've been in some contexts where it was almost like being a multi-ethnic community, that's the goal. And therefore, what looks good on a brochure or what kind of that manufactured. And for me, I realized if we are authentically planting the gospel wherever our community is held. So for us right now, it's in Midtown Manhattan.
Yeah.
Then hopefully our church community will then begin to reflect that neighborhood and still want to build bridges with marginalized people throughout our city. So
That's,
I think there's this local incarnation. That's part of how I think justice, the idea of justice being proximate,
yep.
it has to come through these personal relationships that occur. Now, of course, the city itself can be segregated. So what do we do then? And so one of the reasons why we've started a family of churches is so that we can actually be a local embodied presence, but be part of a bigger movement that is, bridging barriers across class and race and all that stuff,
Yes.
And so, actually, and I'm not sure if Nils, if you've heard of the sixfold test that our denomination, the Covenant Church, has.
No.
It's actually a really helpful tool as it relates to whether or not we've been doing a good job at building bridges. Do you mind if I look it up real quick, and I'll just
look it up.
And again, it's our denomination's Evangelical Covenant Church, and the sixfold test is basically this is an inventory that we're encouraged to take for ourselves to press forward in ethnic ministry and diversity. And I'll read the 6 things right now to you. If that's okay.
Please.
Number 1 is, it says population. Is the covenant reaching increasing numbers of people among increasing numbers of populations as it relates to multi-ethnicity? Participation. Are we finding ways to engage life together through denominational conference and local events, service, and fellowship? So again, participation across different ethnic barriers. Power. Are the positions and structures of influence influenced by the perspective and gifts of diverse populations? Pace setting. With additional perspectives, burdens, and gifts in our midst, what new ministry opportunities is the ECC now better positioned to strengthen and initiate? Purposeful narrative. How do the stories of new backgrounds become incorporated into our overarching history? How do all of these streams flow together into one story moving forward? And then lastly, it's practicing solidarity. In what ways are we standing with and advocating for the multi-ethnic mosaic? How are we sharing in the suffering of others on both an individual and communal level? So these 6 things: population, participation, power, pace setting, purposeful narrative, and practicing solidarity. Like, I know that we as a community, and just to give some context, like the first church that we started in Astoria was like super diverse, across race and class. Our church in Roosevelt Island that we started, super diverse race and class. Then church in Midtown was like 95% Korean American. And so for us, though, we knew that this was a value. So we just basically said, well, it won't be solved overnight, but how do we cultivate a community that will bridge barriers? And so that's when we started to kind of work through this own inventory of population, participation, power, pace setting, purposeful narrative, practicing solidarity. And through that, our congregation has become far more diverse than when it started. But it's because we've said we want to lean into the Spirit, and we want to lean into the values of bridging barriers. And hopefully, if our dinner tables and our neighbors realize that the dinner tables are itself becoming more diverse, then I think our churches will follow suit. And the ways that we want to come and partner alongside other people. So, sorry, that was a long kind of answer.
Oh, that's so helpful. I think you're getting to, though, some things we can do. And I think this is where sometimes you just feel like I'm beginning to see the problem. I just don't know what to do. And I think those you gave very practical direction there. Drew, and maybe even getting practical here out of ignorance for those that are listening. What, from a language standpoint, I know that should people use the term Asian American? Is there offense? I think a lot of Asians are also often defined as Chinese.
Yeah.
How just language wise is appropriate, and what's offensive?
Yeah, what's interesting too about that very question, and it relates to this whole Asian American conversation. What's tricky about it is, I think even Asian Americans, you're going to get different answers.
Okay.
So I would say this is one of the most meaningful times at least in my lifetime, where the Asian American solidarity has been at an all-time high. Because I think in previous iterations, when talking about race for Asian Americans, I think there have been different perspectives. Like there are some, again, like I mentioned, the grateful immigrant story,
Yep.
And others, there's more of like, very strongly activists who are fighting against anti-Asian bias, and then there's a whole group of people that are simply apathetic and are just here to put their head down and get good jobs and all that stuff. So I think in terms of that spectrum, I would say that there's been far less solidarity until recently for Asian Americans. So with that said, I can tell you what I prefer. I don't know how other people would prefer, but I think Asian American. And then I grew up, South Korea was such a small country. Yeah. Almost every one of my classmates would say, oh, he's Chinese or he's Japanese. Or they would ask me, hey, are you Chinese or Japanese? Like those were the only two categories. Then I'd say Korea. People were like, what? Where's that? Then the Seoul Olympics happened in 1988. And so like a lot changed for Koreans after that. But, and now, I see Korean food everywhere and Korean. So I certainly identify as a Korean American. I think when people refer to me as an Asian American, that's fine.
Yeah.
And I think when people refer to me as as an American, that's fine as well. So any one of those distinctions,
That's good. That's helpful. Now, I want to maybe bring this conversation together of if our kids 30 years from now are having a similar conversation, what do you hope that conversation is about? What do you hope that they're saying?
I hope they're saying, isn't it amazing how the gospel of Jesus Christ was the leading voice and the leading embodiment of bringing together a family that nothing else in this world could ever bring together. And I hope they're celebrating that, and I hope they're finding hope in how Jesus is really the ultimate bridge builder and how the gospel breaks down barriers. And I hope the church, instead of being known as a place that's laughing when slurs are used, that it's known as a place that stands on behalf of justice, solidarity, and the multi-ethnic mosaic that we see in the book of Revelation. And I hope that's the future that we see. And if they can look back and be the generation that saw less of this because of their commitment to the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I hope that is the conversation. I pray that is the conversation that they're having. And Drew, I'm so grateful for your friendship. We love you. We love your family. And we look forward to pushing this conversation forward and making a change in this world together. So thank you so much for taking the time and having this conversation.
Thanks, Nils. Love you, man. And grateful for your friendship.